Hey all, hope all is well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 9 game from the St. Louis Norm Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 8 video, you know that I lost my 7th game of the tournament and was now standing on a half point out of 8, and it was really just truly a total disaster. I already sort of hinted at health issues a bit earlier in the event, but after losing so many games, it was just so disheartening, and it was difficult to stay positive. And the last game was actually on my birthday, and at this point, I just wanted to get out of Dodge. So on May 21st, the day of this 9th round, I was actually happy because I knew I had one more game left to play, and then I could just get out of there and jet from St. Louis and create new memories, because that was pretty much where I was at that particular moment. Now, my opponent in this one was none other than Joel Banawa, a player originally from California that I believe is now living in New York, teaching and such, but really good guy. A full-time chess instructor as well, and has a good reputation as an instructor, and just generally well-liked, always in good spirits, and really nice to talk with and analyze with. So it's always nice to be around him. But of course, he was my opponent today and had to put those things to the side. So Joel was white and I was black. So without further ado, let me get into it. So he opened with e4, and I went c6, d4, d5, and then e takes d5, which actually kind of surprised me because I wasn't so sure that the exchange variation was in his repertoire, but it turned out it was. And after c takes d5, bishop d3, knight c6, and c3, here I actually started to realize why it actually was in his repertoire, because it's actually kind of similar to lines of the London system, actually. So let me back up and just show you what that looks like. So if white goes d4, d5, bishop f4, let's say c5, e6, knight c6, c3, knight f6. If there's an exchange on d4, this doesn't happen. Oops, let me say e6 was played first, actually. Let's say knight d2 and takes. And taking on d4 doesn't happen so often in the for black in the London system, because it's not always good to release tension. Normally it's better to keep tension. But if this exchange happens, this position is actually an exchange Caro-Kann, because the pawn structure is exactly the same. The bishop pops out to d3 like it normally would. And if you just compare the structure, it's actually the same. So it actually, when I thought about it, when I realized, oh, this position is actually pretty much the same thing as a London system, which I knew Joel actually played, it actually made sense why he went for this. And it's something where I should have actually taken note of that in preparation, because it would have been really easy to predict what line of the Caro-Kann he would play, and then I would have been more prepared for the exchange variation of the Caro. Unfortunately, I was not and hadn't done this deductive reasoning before the game, so I just kind of had to figure out when I got here what to do. And I wanted to play a line he perhaps didn't look at, so I decided to play knight f6, which is not a new move by any stretch. But after bishop f4, which is, a normal move in the London system, I went e6. And e6 is actually very unusual, because typically in the London system, or in the exchange Caro for that matter, black actually wants to get this light-squared bishop outside the pawn chain. So a lot of times what happens is bishop g4 is played, and after queen b3, there's actually queen c8. And there are lines that look like this, where the queen is temporarily on c8, defending the b7 pawn. And this bishop is kind of strangely placed here, but in the long term would love to be rerouted to g6, where it can get rid of white's really nice bishop on d3. So the line might continue knight d6, knight d2, bishop h5, knight f3, bishop g6. And this is the type of position where I think white is still slightly, ever so slightly better because this bishop is on a really nice diagonal here. But black is a fairly compact structure, and c4 isn't really in the cards because black can just reinforce with e6 and sometimes even knight a5 in certain positions after black castles. So black would kind of be fine here, but I figured Joel had such a great experience in the London system that it might not have been the best idea to test him on this particular territory. So instead, I actually opted for e6, which is extremely unusual. And so what's the idea with e6? The idea is actually to very quickly play bishop d6 and just get rid of this pesky bishop on f4, which is usually very, very annoying on this diagonal. The flip side is that the bishop on c8 is a bad bishop for an extended period of time. And so it's actually not the best system, but it's just a little bit offbeat. So anyways, knight d2 was played, and I went for bishop d6, and then this trade happened, and knight gf3 was played. And this kind of highlights some of the issue in the position, because white really has a nice bind on the e5 square, and very quickly, if white is able to play like queen e2 or maybe castles and rook e1 and put a piece on e5, he's going to be able to initiate a very, very nasty initiative on the king side based upon the knight e5 as like an anchor or a wedge that kind of splits my position in two. So in many, many respects, it's extremely, extremely dangerous to play this way, and I would not recommend this line to anyone, frankly, not even to myself. I won't play this line again, I promise. So anyways, I castled, and white castled, and believe it or not, as much as I condemn this line, I checked the database, and it's been played maybe like, I think like 50 or 60 times, so, and even by a few decent players, so it's not like it's not unheard of, but the computer actually wants to play e5 here, and I think that kind of illustrates the kind of two results game that white would have in this position and how black actually has no winning chances here. Because after d takes e5, knight takes e5, and then another trade, after knight f3, white can very, very easily blockade the d5 pawn by putting the knight on d4. And it's just a very, very long-term nagging edge that white has, where black's not going to have any like bad pieces necessarily, but having this extra pawn island is going to be incredibly frustrating to contend with. So it's just not really a great position if this is the best that black can get. And otherwise, black is just at if black doesn't play e5, he's just at a serious space disadvantage because, again, the knight can just firmly position itself on e5 when the time is right. So instead of e5, I actually played bishop d7, which is more modest, and I was just ceding the e5 square, but not ideal. White played rook e1, now firmly preparing this knight e5 move, and my idea here actually was not to allow the knight to come to e5 with my queen kind of stuck in the middle here, because once the knight comes to e5, I can never play knight takes e5 because of the fork on my queen on d6 and my knight on f6. So my idea in this structure, and frankly it's not really much of an idea, it's just something I'd played in Blitz a few years ago, was actually to play queen f4. And this was the move I actually played. And the idea is that now when knight e5 comes, I can actually choose to take on e5 if I feel like, because essentially there's not going to be a fork. Now, the downside of that is this knight on f6 would actually not really have many good squares to go to after knight e5. So I really have to be quite careful about even taking on e5 and allowing this wedge. All in all, though, I'll just say that this is not a very particularly good opening line. And I think, honestly, it kind of just represents part of the cynicism I had in the tournament at this point, where my preparation was just not up to par. I mean, I must confess, I did not prepare for round 9 and with the same vigor that I prepared for round 1 or round 2 or even round 7 for that matter. I was so discouraged that I just thought, you know what, I should just play a game and, see what happens and not really worry about preparation, because it wasn't really the openings that was the reason why I was losing these games, let me put it that way. So anyways, after queen f4, white played queen e2. Makes sense. If you play knight e5 right away, after knight takes e5, d takes c5, there's actually knight g4, which attacks f2 and h2. And there is a way to kind of defend both of those squares by playing knight f3, but maybe white did not want to put this knight on f3, so it does make sense if you didn't want to allow knight g4 to actually just wait on it and wait on playing knight e5. So instead, queen e2 is a useful move. It connects the rooks. Knight e5 is still in the cards, so everything is fine for white. Given that knight e5 wasn't played, though, I found the opportunity to play rook b8. And my idea here was that maybe I can try and get something going on the queen side relatively quickly before white gets this anchor on e5 and really presses me down on the king side. But it turns out that this move is not super effective because at the end of the day, the bishop on b5 and the queen on e2 are eyeing that square, and white could go a4 if he wanted to stop b5, so it doesn't really help my cause too much. White now played knight b3, and I think this is actually a really, really good move and also emphasizes why b5 is not such a great idea. Because, okay, b5 is actually a mistake now because a pawn is actually hanging, but even in the future, whenever I try to go b5, the knight has this lovely c5 square where it's unassailable and can't be challenged again if a pawn is on b5 because the d and b pawns would both be moved adjacent to c5. And from c5, it'd just be a really, really nagging outpost. So not really something that I want to allow. And so I actually just decided, you know what, b5 is not in the cards here. And instead, I went for the move rook fc8. And my idea here is that if knight c5 came, I really wanted to preserve this bishop on d7, so I thought bishop e8 would be sensible. And I thought it'd be nice to be able to keep that bishop on e8. It's protecting the f7 pawn. And then maybe at some moment I might wheel my knight around to c4 with knight a5, c4, or I might play b5, b4 at some point if this battery is distracted. But I just thought my rooks on c8 and b8, would eventually be able to get some pressure on the c and b files. But the downside of this move is I'm moving more pieces away from my king side, which will be somewhat sensitive given the fact that knight e5 is coming any day now. And the day was today. So knight e5 was played right away, actually challenging this bishop on d7, taking this control in the center. And it's actually a very, very precarious position now because if I play knight takes e5, after d takes e5, my knight really can't go to g4 anymore and be comfortable because after g3, the queen's actually protecting the f2 pawn, and the queen would have to dart back to a square where it's also protecting the knight on g4, and there's only one square that does that. And the problem is after queen g5, now white can even play f4, and you could see that all this space that white is taking on the king side is extremely unpleasant, and my knight and queen are kind of floundering. In addition, after d takes e5 is played, now the d4 square is cleared for the knight on b3, and this is a lovely blockading square for the knight. So after a move like queen h5, only one to save my knight. Now knight d4 comes, and the difference in white's pieces compared to black's is astounding. I mean, the dark square control is really great. The light squared bishop for white is better than the black's counterpart. And the knight on d4 is supremely better than the knight on g4. So all these factors would lead to a significant white edge. And that's why when knight e5 was played, I actually thought, wow, I can't actually take this piece right now. I wound up playing bishop e8 just to kind of keep the tension a little bit and also secure the d7 square for my knight so that now if I take, I can actually play knight d7 instead of having to go out to g4. One other point of order here, if I played knight takes e5, d takes e5, is in addition to g4, the only other square that's really relevant is e8. And e8 would be terrible because from e8, I can't get back to a reasonable square anytime soon. I can't get back to f6 or d6. If I go via c7, where's it going to go? I mean, a6 to c5 doesn't look very realistic. So there were just no realistic squares for my knight to go to if I took the e5 knight right away. So after bishop e8, white played g3. That's a good move, kicking my queen away. And queen a6 is a really, really not a great square to go to here. I mean, it's kind of shut off. It's kind of just cut off from the center, which is not ideal. The only thing positive I can say about it is at least it's near the king. And so there is some benefit to the king being a little bit more secure with the queen nearby. And that's part of the reason why I went for queen f4 in the first place, was because if white went for a kingside pawn storm, I could try to fianchetto my queen with g6 and queen g7. Very, very strange, I know. After queen h6, white now went h4, which is also a pretty good move, just taking more space on that side of the board. And you can see here the queen is actually trapped. There are no squares the queen could go to that are secure. So really, really not a great position for me. And frankly, an opening failure. This has not been a good opening at all. I went knight takes e5, now trading that knight because I realized that white has so much space that I want to kind of, trade pieces to kind of contain white's activity. And after d takes e5, I went knight d7. So at least now my knight has a decent square, and it might be able to reroute to c5. And I thought, okay, this is bad, but it's not that bad. My pieces aren't so terribly placed. Maybe I can one day get b5, b4 going, get some pawn storm going. But at the same time, white has excellent dark square control, definitely more space in the center, and a really wonderful outpost on d4. After knight d7, white did play knight d4, and I actually thought this was a mistake because it actually ceded the c5 square to my knight. Instead, I thought the move rook a d1 was more precise. And the point is, if I go knight c5, now white can just take, and after queen g4, you can just see here that this position is going to be more pleasant for white because of the space in the center and the control of the dark squares. And so it's going to be very, very difficult to execute some type of minority attack when my queen is nowhere close to being relevant in the game. And again, the dark squares are so weak. So this would have been kind of a better way to play, a safer way to play. And after knight d4, I actually get a little active with knight c5. White, and here's actually a tricky thing. So white played bishop c2 to preserve the bishop, and that's a good move. But you might say, well, wouldn't it be a good knight versus bad bishop endgame? Why does it matter? Why can't white just play a move like rook a d1 and give up the bishop? And the reason for this is actually after knight takes d3, queen takes d3. Believe it or not, if I get an a5 and then b5, so if I get in like b5 and then a5 and b4, it's actually going to be very difficult for this knight to be secure on d4 forever. So just to give you an example, let's say rook e2. After b4 is played and I undermine this pawn chain enough, and if the c3 pawn drops, all of a sudden this knight on d4 is going to be quite loose. And when the knight on d4 is loose, and it's no longer such a powerful piece because knights normally need anchors to support them in the center. And so hypothetically, if this knight becomes loose and weak because the c pawn drops, then my position actually becomes very favorable. And in particular, the bishop can spring to life, perhaps jumping to c6, playing d4, and all of a sudden a diagonal would open. So the reason that he kept the bishop is because even though the good knight versus bad bishop thing is kind of relevant in the short term, in the long term, if I'm able to break the pawn structure, it might not actually be a strength for white. So keep that in mind. Knights need pawns typically to anchor themselves. So after bishop c2, I went for b5, and I actually set about to try and weaken this knight's protection on d4, its anchor on d4, which is the c3 pawn. So I really, really thought, okay, I'm getting somewhere here. After b5, white played a3, and with this move, Joel actually offered a draw. And I thought about it for some time because I was thinking, well, can I get an a5 and b4 and undermine this knight? And I was thinking about it, and I was like, yeah, it looks like I can. But after further reflection, I actually agreed to the draw because what I realized is that after a3, if I go a5, and let's say, I don't know, let's say rook c1 is played, for instance. Or excuse me, not rook c1. Let's say, what should we say is played? There was some move here that I was worried about. Basically, the thing I was worried about, essentially, was if I play b4, the rook on the a file becomes very active. And in some lines, it actually would be something I should be concerned about. So, for instance, let's say like b4, a takes b4, a takes b4, and then I move my knight back to like, I don't know, let's say to d7. Well, there's certain scenarios where, first of all, the b5 pawn is very weak because the queen and the knight are both hitting it. But in addition to that, the rook on a7 can play a very important factor. On the a1 can play a very important factor on a7 and really pressure my king side. And again, as long as my queen is kind of trapped here, it has no squares it can go to, this is actually a very, very risky position because opening up the queen side actually might help white get very active. So once I realized that b4 was actually quite double-edged, I thought, you know what? Yeah, I'm probably not better here. White is still better here, and it probably would be a little bit smarter to just agree to the draw before I lose an 8th game. So I actually agreed to a draw here and cut the game short, and my tournament ended. So I finished on 1 out of 9. The worst tournament of my career, and honestly, the worst tournament I probably will ever have, because, I mean, I must say in this tournament I had at least, I didn't always mention them, but I had at least 4 or 5 draw offers in my games, and so just on draw offers alone, if I accept all those draws, that's at least 2 or 3 points, and so it's actually incredibly difficult to just have 1 point from 9 rounds, and I managed to do it. So I think it was a fairly fluky performance, but it really did set me back significantly. In fact, I didn't even want to know how many rating points I lost, but of course I eventually found out. I lost 36 points from this tournament. So 1 out of 9 lost me 36 points. And you might say, well, that's not that much. Maybe it should be worse. Well, at the level that I'm at with the FIDE rating I have, 36 points takes multiple tournaments to try and pick up. So, it set me back several months to try and get back to that level that I was at. And so I went from 2468 FIDE, which is 32 points away from, the 2500 number, the magical Grandmaster rating that you need. I went from 2468 to 2432 from one tournament. And it took me in the totally opposite direction. So it was incredibly, incredibly frustrating and gut-wrenching, but I had to move on, and that's what I decided to do. So you're going to see more games going forward, and, I do eventually move on because you just have to do it. So it is what it is. Anyways, thanks for watching and following this nightmare of a tournament, and if you like, please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thank you very much. Take care.